On the grey edge of the Wiltshire Downs, where the chalk fields ran long and lonely between weather-beaten cottages and brooding hedgerows, there stood a modest stone manor with ivy creeping up its sides like time itself. The house was called Bleakstone Hollow. It had stood empty for years, until Widow Agnes Harrow returned to it, like a shadow curling back into its source. She was elegant, severe, and her presence unnerved even the postman, who swore she never cast a proper shadow in the morning light. Then, 3 months after her return, they found Charles Denham dead in her drawing-room. And not just dead, posed. It was the maid who found him, a slip of a girl named Elsie, barely 16 and not at all prepared to walk in on a man laid out on the chaise lounge as if attending his own wake. His hands were folded neatly on his chest. A single red rose lay between them. His shoes were polished. His expression was eerily peaceful, yet none of that was the strangest thing. There wasn't a single mark on him. No wound, no sign of struggle, not a drop of blood anywhere. The windows were locked from the inside. The only door had been bolted, and Widow Harrow was supposedly out taking her morning walk across the fields. There were no footprints in the mud, no signs of forced entry, and, perhaps most confounding, Charles Denham had been declared dead by natural causes. Heart failure, the coroner said, though he was only 40 and hale the day before. Chief Inspector Cray from Devizes arrived in a bitter mood. "I tell you, something's off," he muttered to his sergeant. "That woman's buried 3 husbands, and now this man, an old admirer, I'm told, is found dead in her home, and all she can say is, 'I suppose Charles always had a weak heart.'" He didn't like it, nor did the locals, who whispered behind closed curtains about the widow's curse. They said all the men she ever loved ended up 6 feet under, each time with less and less of an explanation. Miss Marple heard about the case quite by accident. She had been staying with her cousin Emily in nearby Swindon, enjoying a few days of quiet knitting and backgammon, when the newspaper's headline caught her eye. "4th man dies in widow's house." Her curiosity piqued, not by the death, but by the strange composition of it all. Posed, a red rose, a locked room, peaceful face. She made polite inquiries and was soon invited by Inspector Cray himself. Not because he valued her insight, though he had heard stories, but because, frankly, he was stumped. The evidence was all wrong. No fingerprints, no sign of poison, no motive anyone could prove. And the woman? Cool as a winter pond. Miss Marple arrived at Bleakstone Hollow with a calm demeanour and her best tweed coat. She met Agnes Harrow that afternoon. The widow was dressed in soft charcoal grey, her hair pinned back with precise elegance, and her hands as smooth as porcelain. "Such a dreadful tragedy," Agnes said over tea. "Charles was always terribly sentimental. You know, he used to send me roses when we were 20. Miss Marple nodded. "And he died with one in his hands. How very touching." Agnes gave a tight smile, her eyes unreadable. Yes, poetic, really. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, long enough for the echo of it to reveal something, but Agnes merely sipped her tea and said nothing more. The drawing-room had already been combed by police, but Miss Marple asked to see it regardless. She moved about slowly as though the air itself might confess something. The chaise lounge remained exactly where the body had been found, though the rose was now gone. The fireplace was unused. The books on the shelf ranged from Victorian novels to books on botany and classical sculpture. "Interesting taste," she murmured. "No mystery novels?" Agnes, standing in the doorway, gave a hint of amusement. "I prefer true crime." Miss Marple's fingers paused on a leather-bound volume, the symbolist movement in art and literature. She turned one page, then another, and then she asked, almost absently, "You've kept this place very private. No guests since your return." Agnes's expression didn't flicker. "Only Charles. He came unexpectedly. I hadn't seen him in years." "Yet he died with a rose," Miss Marple said gently. "A gesture from the past, perhaps." Agnes's tone cooled. "Are you suggesting something, Miss Marple?" "Oh, no, dear. I've simply found, in my little village of St. Mary Mead, that some people try to resurrect old romances, and others try to bury them for good." The next morning, Miss Marple took a walk through the village. She stopped at the grocer's, the chapel, the post office. People talked, as they always did, when a kindly old lady inquires with just the right touch of naive charm. What she learned confirmed her suspicion. Every one of Agnes's former lovers had died either in her presence or shortly after seeing her. Not one death had been criminal, on paper, but patterns speak, even when evidence does not. Miss Marple returned to Bleakstone Hollow with a fresh theory blooming behind her eyes, like the roses that had begun to wither in the late summer heat. She requested to see the study, a room no one had searched thoroughly yet. Agnes hesitated for a moment too long. "It's rather private." "I'm quite used to that," said Miss Marple gently. "I never look where I'm not invited." Agnes relented. The study was shadowed and smelled of sandalwood and dried lavender. On the desk was a locked drawer. When Miss Marple asked what was inside, Agnes replied, "Just old letters." The inspector, now fully intrigued, had the drawer opened. Inside were dozens of envelopes, all of them from men, some familiar names, others not, all intimate, all affectionate. One from Charles, dated 3 days before his death, said, "I'm coming. I must see you once more. I dreamt of you last night. A red rose on your table. It felt like a sign." Another, far older, from her first husband, mentioned the same rose. Miss Marple asked for the coroner's report again. Something had always bothered her. Charles Denham had supposedly died of heart failure, but no cardiac history, no exertion, just sudden, unexplained collapse. "I think," she said slowly, "that the key isn't in how he died, but why he felt safe enough to die." Inspector Cray blinked. "Safe?" Miss Marple looked at the photograph on the mantel. Agnes with her first husband, Edward Harrow. Behind them, the same chaise lounge, the same smile on her lips. "She gave them what they wanted," Miss Marple said softly. "The illusion that they were still loved, still desired. She made it beautiful, intimate. She read their old letters, posed them like saints, and let them drift off, believing she had finally said yes." The inspector frowned. "But that's not a crime." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Not unless you consider it assisted heartbreak. I imagine she said just enough to bring them peace, and then watched as their hearts betrayed them." "Psychological manipulation?" "Perhaps. Or simply the artistry of farewell." Agnes Harrow was never charged. There was no poison, no force, only a rose, and a look of perfect peace on each man's face. But Miss Marple never forgot her. Some women wield knives, others words, but Agnes Harrow needed neither. She only needed to say, "I still love you," and they believed her. The following morning brought a mist that clung low to the hedgerows, as if the fields themselves were reluctant to let go of the night's secrets. Bleakstone Hollow looked as it always did, timeless and still, ivy-laced and discreet. But to Miss Marple's discerning eye, the house had begun to speak, and like all old houses, it told its truth not in words, but in silence, in shadows, and in the things that ought not to be there at all. Inspector Cray had returned to Devizes, promising to keep an eye on the file, though he had little appetite for a case with no legal foothold. Miss Marple, however, remained. Officially, she was recovering from a faint spell brought on by an excess of lavender and lingering emotion. Unofficially, she was watching. She wandered the grounds as an old woman might, slowly, with measured steps, pausing now and then to admire the hydrangeas or remark on the quality of the stonework. But her eyes, those bright blue eyes beneath the brim of her hat, missed nothing. That's when she noticed the statue. It was a marble bust tucked into the garden alcove, a classical piece, Roman perhaps, though clearly weathered by age. But what struck her was not the sculpture itself, but the object behind it, a small, crushed tin of violet pastils, tucked just behind the pedestal, as if hastily discarded and forgotten. She stooped to examine it. The tin had been flattened. Underfoot, the lid bent backwards. Not a trace of pastille powder inside. Strange, she thought. The brand was French, not easily found in Wiltshire shops. Miss Marple filed it away quietly and returned to the drawing-room. Agnes was there, seated in the sunlit corner, embroidering with meticulous care. She looked up with a practised smile. "You've taken to our gardens, I see." "They remind me of Colonel Weatherby's rose paths. Though he never had statues, of course. He thought them frightful. Miss Marple settled gently into a chair. "You enjoy classical pieces?" Agnes paused. "I suppose I always have." "Did Charles Denham?" There was the slightest flicker, nothing so strong as discomfort, merely the briefest lapse in the rhythm of the needle. "He had no opinion on them," she said, eyes lowered. "He was more of a man for the moment." Miss Marple nodded, slowly pulling her knitting from her bag. The room settled into quiet, save for the soft scratch of thread and the rhythmic clack of needles. But beneath that surface, something shifted. Later that day, the maid Elsie passed Miss Marple in the hallway. She was pale and twitchy, with hands that constantly worried the hem of her apron. "You mustn't think she's bad," the girl blurted without prompting. "Mrs. Harrow, I mean. She's always been kind. She gave me her old gloves just last week." Miss Marple looked at her gently. "I'm sure she has a very kind heart, my dear." She didn't do anything wrong, not really," Elsie whispered. "And it wasn't even locked. The door. That morning, I found it open." The words dropped like stones into water. "But you told Inspector Cray it was bolted from the inside," Miss Marple said softly. Elsie's face drained of colour. "That's what she said to say. That's what she told me. I didn't want any trouble, you see." "I do see. And did Mr. Denham arrive that morning? Or had he stayed the night?" The girl looked cornered and her lips trembled. "I'm sorry," she said, and fled down the corridor. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind working with silent precision. The locked room illusion was unravelling. There had been no bolt, no mystery about how Charles had entered or left, because he had never left. He had been there all night, which meant Agnes had lied. And if she had lied about that, what else? Miss Marple returned once more to the study, ostensibly to examine a volume of poetry she had remembered fondly. She moved with great care now, her fingers grazing along the book spines, noting where the dust lay thick and where it had been recently disturbed. She found the second oddity there. It was a slip of notepaper, wedged between books on Greek mythology. The writing was unmistakably Charles Denham's. Long loops, strong pressure. It read, "This is the last time. If you refuse me again, I'll make sure the truth is known. I've kept your letters, Agnes. You can't pretend forever." A threat. Not a lover's note, but a demand. So Charles had not come for reconciliation. He had come for leverage. Miss Marple folded the note carefully, her pulse a steady metronome. Returning to the drawing room, she found Agnes still embroidering, a small classical radio playing chamber music from the corner. "I used to know a woman in St. Mary Mead who embroidered to forget," Miss Marple said lightly. "She once confessed to me she stabbed a flower each time she thought of her first husband. After 3 cushions, she'd work through him completely." Agnes gave a quiet laugh, though it was too precise. "I embroider because I enjoy peace." "Peace can be terribly deceptive," Miss Marple mused. "Some of the worst crimes are committed in peaceful places, and some of the most dangerous people are the ones who never raise their voice." Agnes looked up. Her smile never reached her eyes. "Are you accusing me of something, Miss Marple?" "Oh, not at all. I'm simply reflecting. You see, I've noticed a few inconsistencies. The bolted door, the rose, and, most curiously, a tin of pastilles behind your garden statue." Agnes blinked just once. "Charles used to take those," she said, a shade too quickly, "for his nerves." "Did he?" Odd that they weren't found with his things. Agnes's hand stilled on the fabric. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone warm, almost maternal. "I do think, my dear, that something happened that morning. Something quite different than what you told the inspector. I believe Charles came to threaten you, perhaps even blackmail you, and I believe he died, quite naturally, but you saw your chance to create a scene, a performance, a tableau. To make his death say something, it didn't." Silence fell, broken only by the quiet trill of the radio. Agnes set her embroidery aside, smoothing her skirt with slow, graceful hands. "You're very clever, Miss Marple. I've simply lived long enough to know what people are capable of when they've been wounded deeply enough." Agnes's voice lowered. "I didn't kill him, but I wanted him to suffer, just a little." "Then why the rose?" Miss Marple asked softly. Agnes looked at her. "Because he never gave me one when it mattered, and now He'd never be able to again. Outside, the mist was beginning to lift, but inside Bleakstone Hollow, the air remained thick with secrets. Miss Marple said nothing more, but in her mind the pattern had already begun to emerge, delicate as lace, yet undeniable. She still didn't have the full picture, but the first threads of deception had been pulled, and the next would unravel soon. By mid-afternoon the clouds began to part, and the fields surrounding Bleakstone Hollow turned the colour of wet brass. The village stirred more openly now. Gossip had gathered like floodwater in the lanes, and Miss Marple knew that time, more than truth, was often the lever, that pried secrets loose. She asked, ever so gently, to speak with those closest to the scene, and by then Agnes Harrow, whose calm now carried a faint brittleness around the edges, agreed. "Of course," she said. "You may question whomever you like. I've nothing to hide." The first to be called was the maid, Elsie. Still pale, her hands trembling like reeds, she stood in the dim morning room and stared at her shoes as if they might whisper the right answers. Miss Marple, seated by the hearth, offered her a smile. "You've been very helpful already, my dear. But memory can be a curious thing, especially after something as upsetting as finding poor Mr. Denham." Elsie nodded slowly. I didn't mean to lie. She told me to say the door was locked. And I thought it must have been, even if I found it ajar. Maybe I forgot." "But now you're sure it was open?" "Yes," Elsie whispered. "I was bringing in the tea tray, same as always, but the door just opened. A little stuck, but not locked." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you see Mrs. Harrow that morning?" "Number she was out. In the orchard, I think. She always walks early." Miss Marple made a small note of that. Then she asked, as if in passing, "Did you happen to see Mr. Denham's shoes?" The girl blinked. "His shoes?" "Yes. Were they muddy? Or clean?" I think they were polished." "Thank you, dear." When Elsie had gone, Miss Marple sat in quiet thought. Polished shoes. That told her something. It meant Charles hadn't come traipsing through the fields that morning. He'd arrived earlier, perhaps even the night before, and been admitted through the front. Next came the groundskeeper, Mr. Peel. A broad-shouldered man of 50, with sun-darkened skin and a jaw perpetually clenched around a piece of barley straw, he offered a nod that could have passed for either greeting or warning. "I didn't much like the fellow," Peel said, when asked about Charles Denham. "Always smiling too wide, like a fox, that one." "Did you see him the day he died?" "I did. Came up the drive just before dusk the night before. Asked if Mrs. Harrow was receiving visitors. I said I'd let her know." "And did you?" "I did. She told me to send him in." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "So he spent the night?" "Must have. Never saw him leave, and his motor car was still there the next morning." "And did Mrs. Harrow tell you what he wanted?" "She said it was a personal matter." "Did she seem upset?" He gave it real thought. "Not upset. More tight, if you know what I mean. Wound like a clock spring." "Did you hear anything overnight?" Raised voices. "Only owls, ma'am." When Peel had left, Miss Marple turned her thoughts toward a curious man who had appeared at the house the evening after the death, the local solicitor, Mr. Lionel Crowthorne, polite to a fault, with an unfortunate moustache and a voice like damp wool. He had arrived uninvited to assist with any legal affairs arising from the unfortunate event. Miss Marple found his presence odd. "You were quite prompt," she said, when he joined her in the library. "I happened to be passing through. Mrs. Harrow and I are old acquaintances." "Indeed?" Through her late husband. "Edward Harrow, yes. I helped draw up his will." "Ah," she said. "And Mr. Denham's presence here, was that expected?" Crowthorne cleared his throat. "To some extent. He had contacted me recently. Rather curious correspondence. Something about old debts and old flames. He hinted that he might be adding Mrs. Harrow to his will." Remarkable, considering they hadn't spoken in years. Yes, well, Charles was a romantic idiot. Never could forget a pretty face. "And did he mention any threats? Concerns?" The solicitor looked uncomfortable. He believed he had something on her. Letters, perhaps, though I never saw them. He asked vaguely about the legality of... Persuasive leverage. Blackmail? Crowthorne shrugged, palms up. He never said the word, but that was the tone. Miss Marple thanked him and asked only one last question. Do you know what became of Charles's briefcase? Briefcase? Yes. Surely he carried one, especially if he brought documents. The solicitor blinked. I didn't see one. Neither had the constable, nor the inspector, nor Elsie. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A grown man arrives unannounced, threatening to reveal something, and dies that night. No briefcase, no documents. Someone had taken it, hidden it, perhaps burned it. That evening, Miss Marple requested a final conversation with Agnes Harrow herself. They met in the conservatory as the sunset melted gold across the panes. Agnes looked composed, almost serene, but there was a guardedness to her posture now, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I've heard such conflicting stories, Miss Marple said gently, from your maid, from Mr. Peel, from the solicitor. Agnes raised a brow. Do stories ever agree? Even in courtrooms there are always contradictions. That's true, but sometimes it's the contradictions that illuminate the truth, like a lantern behind stained glass. Suddenly, the picture becomes clearer. Agnes said nothing. I know Charles arrived the night before he died, Miss Marple continued. I know he came with an intent to force your hand, perhaps with old letters, perhaps worse. I know he stayed, and at some point that night or morning, he died. Agnes gave a quiet sigh. He collapsed in the study. He clutched his chest and fell. I was frightened. I didn't know what to do. But instead of calling for help, you posed him. I didn't kill him. I believe you. Agnes stood slowly and walked to the glass. He told me he kept every letter I ever wrote, said he'd ruin me, said I owed him my reputation, my future, all because he was too proud to accept that the past had ended. And the briefcase? Miss Marple asked softly. I burned it. I had to. And the rose? Agnes smiled faintly. A theatrical touch. He always wanted poetry, so I gave him one final stanza. Outside, the last of the light bled over the downs, casting the world in the pale blue of unfinished stories. Miss Marple didn't speak again that evening, but she had heard what she needed. Everyone had told a version of the truth, but only Agnes had spoken in full verse. The voices of deception had fallen silent, and in their echoes the real shape of things had begun to emerge. Not a murder, not a crime, but a reckoning, one disguised in grace but delivered like a final line from a forgotten play. The next morning, Bleakstone Hollow sat under a brittle autumn sun that cast long, exaggerated shadows across the grounds, shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should, as if the house itself remembered too much. Inside, Miss Marple moved quietly through its rooms, the murmur of polished shoes on old wood as steady as her thoughts. The picture was not yet complete, but the fragments she held were beginning to align. She needed motive, true motive, not merely opportunity, and certainly not theatrics. Charles Denham had died of heart failure, yes, but his presence, his timing, and what he carried or didn't suggested far more than an unfortunate twist of fate. Too many people had reason to wish him gone, but the real question was, who had most to lose if he lived? Miss Marple began with what she did best. She sorted people not by titles, but by types, not who they appeared to be, but what they quietly revealed in passing moments. Agnes Harrow was the obvious centre of the storm, yet Miss Marple no longer believed she had orchestrated Charles's death in the literal sense. Her guilt was of another kind, older, deeper, the sort people dress in roses and denial. Agnes had known Charles was dangerous, not for what he might do physically, but for what he represented, the past, unburied. But motives clustered around others too, like bees to spoiled honey. Mr. Peel, the groundskeeper, was next in her mind. A man of blunt edges and long silences, Peel had been with the estate for decades, since Edward Harrow's time. His loyalty to Agnes was clear, perhaps too clear. When Miss Marple asked him whether Charles had stayed the night, he hadn't hesitated. But when pressed about hearing voices, he'd gone oddly still. What had he heard, really? Miss Marple paid him a visit by the tool shed after lunch. He was oiling a pair of hedge clippers with careful precision. "I always admire a man who knows how to keep things sharp," she said lightly. Peel gave a grunt that could have meant anything. She took a slow breath. "You've worked here a long time. You must have known Mr. Denham when he and Mrs. Harrow were young." "I knew of him," he muttered. "Didn't like him then either." "Because he wasn't good for her?" "She had Edward then, and even he wasn't— well, let's say she's had her share of bad judgment. She told me she burned Denham's letters. But I wonder, Mr. Peel, did you help her do it, or did you do it yourself before she saw them?" He looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" "That you might have wanted to protect her, not from danger, but from the embarrassment of what those letters might have revealed. I didn't touch any damn letters." His voice cracked the quiet like a whip, but it wasn't anger that lingered in his eyes. It was fear, not of being caught, but of what might come undone if too much was said. Miss Marple let him stew in his silence. She had what she needed from him, not an admission, but a thread. That afternoon she sought out the solicitor once more. Lionel Crowthorne, still stationed in the village inn under the pretence of handling estate matters, had grown uncharacteristically restless. "Such a complicated business," he sighed as they sat in the inn's drawing-room. "One tries to offer professional support, but grief makes everything delicate." "Is that why you came so quickly?" "Grief?" He smiled uneasily. "I'd heard through the grapevine Charles had visited, and I admit I was curious." "Curious? Or worried?" He didn't answer at first. Then, as if hoping to redirect the conversation, "Charles was impulsive. You know, he once tried to purchase Bleakstone Hollow from Edward Harrow years ago. Planned to turn it into a retreat for artists. Agnes refused. That old battle must have scarred his pride." "Did he know about the Harrow Trust?" Crowthorne froze. "The house is part of a trust left by Edward," Miss Marple continued gently. "It can't be sold or leased without the trustees' approval. Which, incidentally, is you." His throat bobbed. I act in an advisory role. I don't control—" "You control access. You control legal interpretation. If Charles had managed to sway Agnes, marry her again perhaps, or force her hand with those letters, he could have pushed for the house's liquidation, unless someone stopped him." He sat back heavily, hands trembling slightly. "I didn't kill him," he said at last. "No," Miss Marple said, "but you had every reason to wish him silent. You'd lose influence, perhaps more." There was silence. Then, "If you think I took his briefcase—" "I didn't say that," she replied. "But someone did, and it wasn't Agnes." The maze was narrowing, and then there was Elsie. She had lied, yes, but out of fear, not cunning. Yet Miss Marple couldn't help but note a detail from earlier. The tin of pastilles, crushed and empty, not found in Charles's belongings. She called Elsie again, this time to the kitchen, a neutral place. The girl arrived hesitant but calmer. "I want to ask you something very simple," Miss Marple said. "Do you know what happened to Mr. Denham's things? His coat, for example, his pockets." Elsie looked down. "His coat was hung in the vestibule. And his briefcase? I never saw one." "Are you sure?" I think—" Her voice faltered. "I might have seen a bag, not a briefcase, something like a satchel, but it wasn't there later." "Where did you see it?" "In the study, when I went to clean, before I saw him." Miss Marple looked at her with great gentleness. "Did Mrs. Harrow tell you to remove it?" "No." "Then who did?" "I don't know." But Elsie was trembling again. Miss Marple pressed a little more. "Was it gone before or after Mr. Peel went in?" Elsie hesitated, then nodded. "After. He was the last person in there before I brought the tea." Miss Marple sat back, and the web at last began to shimmer with shape. Agnes had the emotional motive, humiliation, fear of scandal. But she had no reason to hide the bag. Crowthorne had the legal motive, but wouldn't risk dirtying his hands. Peel, however, Peel had loyalty, quiet, unwavering, dangerous loyalty. He would do anything to protect Agnes, including destroying evidence. Perhaps he'd found Charles dead, or dying, and acted quickly, removing anything that could cast suspicion or reopen old wounds. Perhaps he'd read the letters himself. But still, it didn't explain the crushed pastille tin. Later that night, Miss Marple returned to the garden statue. The tin remained where she'd tucked it back after her first inspection, untouched. And suddenly she saw what had been missing all along. The tin hadn't been Charles's. It had been used to carry something. Powdered, odourless, perhaps slipped into tea or wine. Something bitter masked by sweet. Something natural enough not to raise suspicion in a coroner's report. Perhaps not heart failure after all. She straightened slowly. The maze had many paths, but one of them led directly to Agnes, and a motive far more personal than fear or shame. She had told him finally that she still loved him, just enough, and then let him sleep forever. 3 days after Charles Denham's death, Inspector Cray returned to Bleakston Hollow with a swagger in his step and a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. The coroner's office had called him early that morning with news. A breakthrough, they claimed. A new analysis of Denham's teacup had revealed traces of digitalis, a compound derived from foxglove. In the right dose, it could treat heart conditions. In the wrong hands, it could stop a heart entirely. "Poison," Cray declared, striding into the drawing room like an actor who'd just been handed the final act. Digitalis. Not heart failure. Not natural causes. We've got a murder now. Miss Marple, seated by the window with her knitting, looked up with calm interest. "How curious," she said, "and how very convenient." "Convenient?" Cray's brow furrowed. "It's conclusive. We'll have the arrest by tomorrow, likely today." "And who, may I ask, are we arresting?" "Agnes Harrow, of course." He glanced at the door, where 2 uniformed officers waited just beyond. "She made the tea. She arranged the scene. She told the maid to lie. She had motive, means, and, now, method." Miss Marple clicked her needles together thoughtfully. "And the foxglove?" "In the garden," Cray said. "Blooming under the east window. You must have seen it. The petals match the compound exactly. And in her own garden, no less." "I dare say foxglove grows in half the gardens in England, Inspector. My own vicar's wife brews a dreadful herbal tonic with it, though not, I think, with lethal intentions." Cray was unmoved. "We've matched the chemical composition to fresh plants found here, and the tea was laced after steeping, added directly to the cup. That's precision, Miss Marple. Intent." He had a point. On paper, it made perfect sense. A poisonous plant on the grounds, an emotionally fraught history, a cup of tea prepared by the widow herself, and the victim found posed as if in tribute. But in Miss Marple's experience, when a case wrapped itself in a tidy bow, it was often because someone had tied it that way. She found Agnes Harrow in her study, sitting behind her late husband's old desk, her fingers interlaced as though holding back something that might shatter if released. "They're going to charge me, aren't they?" she said quietly. "Yes, I expect they will." "And do you think I did it?" Miss Marple considered her. "I think you wanted to, but wanting and doing are rarely the same." Agnes's lips curled faintly. "Charles always said I couldn't finish anything, not even my anger." "Is that why you arranged him like that? As a final word?" Agnes didn't answer, but her eyes flicked for the briefest moment to a drawer in the desk. Miss Marple followed the glance. "Was it his bag?" "Yes." "You kept it?" Number I looked through it. The letters weren't what I feared, just the same old performances. He had no power over me anymore. Her voice was distant. "So I let him sleep." Miss Marple stood slowly. "Then someone else finished what you began." Downstairs, Cray was coordinating the removal of evidence. The teacup, the garden foxglove, a tattered envelope found in the bin marked Belladonna, though it turned out to be an old herb label long faded. The officers moved with certainty, cataloguing everything they believed mattered. They were already preparing their statements. Miss Marple followed one officer to the kitchen, where Elsie was being comforted by the housekeeper. The poor girl had turned ghostly pale again. "I didn't know it was poison," she kept whispering. "She said it would help him sleep." "That's all. Just sleep." Miss Marple leaned down gently. "Who told you that, my dear?" Elsie froze. "Mrs. Harrow. I thought it was just to calm him down. He was so upset." She handed you something? Yes. A little dropper. Said to put in a few drops. She said she'd explain it later. The pieces clicked together. Wrongly. Too neatly. Miss Marple's instincts bristled. It was too exact. Agnes didn't need Charles dead. Not really. She'd already won. She had nothing left to prove. And something else was wrong. Miss Marple returned to the garden. The east flower bed where the foxglove bloomed was wild and overgrown. But another plant caught her attention. Subtle, tucked behind a row of moss-covered bricks. Lily of the valley. Miss Marple frowned. The plant was more potent, more dangerous than foxglove, and far more difficult to trace. But it was not what the lab had found. Unless... She turned and saw the gardener, Mr. Peel, watching her from the hedgerow, arms folded across his chest. "Beautiful plants," she said softly. "You must take great care. Been tending this garden for 20 years. Then you know what everything is." "Of course." She plucked a petal from the foxglove. "Did you know the inspector said this exact strain was found in Mr. Denham's tea?" Peel hesitated. "I heard. But this patch hasn't been touched in months. Look here." She pointed to the dried, crumbling soil. Not a single stem cut, no leaves missing, all of it pristine, not even a trace of dew disturbed. He said nothing. "And this," she continued, moving to the compost heap near the shed. She dug gently, then smiled. "Foxglove trimmings, yes, but all dried, dead, not fresh, and underneath." She pulled aside a layer of wilted grass to reveal a scorched tin, the pastilles tin. She opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny glass vial, empty. "It wasn't foxglove," she said. "It was something else, something fast, tasteless, that left no trace but mimicry." Peel's jaw tightened. "You protected her," Miss Marple said, "but not just out of loyalty. He threatened her, yes, but you hated him. You saw him leave that bag. You read his letters. You saw what he planned to do. And you decided to act." He stared at her for a long, dark moment. She was too good for him. But not too good for you to let her take the blame. "I didn't think it'd go that far. I thought the poison would be blamed on his condition, that he'd die quietly and she'd bury him like all the others." Miss Marple nodded, and then Cray came back. Eager to close the case, found the foxglove, made the leap. "I didn't think they'd test the cup," Peel said quietly. "Not like that." "And now she'll hang for it," Miss Marple said softly. He looked away, but there was no denial in his face. That night, Cray returned with an arrest warrant for Agnes, Harrow, but Miss Marple met him at the door with the tin in her hand and a single page from Toxicological Flora of Britain marked clearly. "You've made a mistake," she said calmly, "and if you don't listen now, the real killer will vanish beneath the same silence that buried all the others." Cray stared at her. "False victories are easy," she said. "Truth takes work." And Agnes Harrow, upstairs in her mourning grey, waited silently for justice to remember her. The morning after Inspector Cray's premature announcement of Agnes Harrow's arrest dawned cold and misty, the kind of chill that settled deep in bones and memories alike. Bleakstone Hollow, with its ivy-clad walls and shuttered windows, seemed to hold its breath as if aware that the tides of the past were about to break upon its doorstep once more. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, the soft click of her knitting needles the only sound in the heavy silence. Though much had been revealed, something still unsettled her, a faint echo of a detail that refused to fall neatly into place. She poured herself a cup of tea and revisited the letters Agnes had burned, the fragments she had glimpsed but never fully examined. They were ordinary, sentimental correspondences for the most part, but one name had caught her eye, a name absent from recent inquiries. Edward Penn, a lawyer from London, who had once been closely connected to the Harrow family. Curious, Miss Marple requested access to the county archives. The small clerk who assisted her looked bewildered but obliging as she pored over old newspaper clippings and dusty legal documents. There, buried in a faded file from 15 years prior, was a story she had not expected. A mysterious disappearance, a scandal whispered behind closed doors, and a quiet settlement that had never been made public. Edward Penn, it seemed, was not merely a lawyer, but also a man with ties to both Agnes and Charles Denham, though the connections were tangled and indirect. He had been Agnes's legal adviser during her first marriage, and later had served as a trustee for a trust fund connected to Charles's family. Yet what intrigued Miss Marple most was a brief mention of a lawsuit involving a breach of contract, allegations of forgery, and a disgraced solicitor who had vanished from the public eye shortly afterward. Could Lionel Crowthorne be that same disgraced solicitor, operating under a carefully maintained veneer of respectability? The pieces fit too neatly to dismiss. Miss Marple returned to Bleakstone Hollow with renewed purpose. During a quiet afternoon tea, she observed the subtle ways Lionel Crowthorne interacted with Agnes and the household. His polite smile seemed practised, his eyes always calculating. When Miss Marple gently inquired about Edward Penn, Crowthorne stiffened, his hand tightening around his cup. "You know far more than I expected," he said, voice smooth but cold. "Some histories are best left undisturbed." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Yet here we are, digging up what lies beneath." Later that evening, a chance remark from the groundskeeper, Mr. Peel, sealed the connection. In a moment of unguarded conversation, he mentioned that years ago there had been a heated argument between Agnes and a lawyer over financial matters, a dispute that had nearly destroyed the Harrow estate. "Penn was a hard man," Peel said gruffly, "but Crowthorne—" He came after, wearing a cleaner face but with the same sharp teeth. The tangled web grew clearer. The feud was not just personal, but financial, a legacy of old betrayals and simmering resentments. Charles Denham's visit had reignited those tensions, threatening to expose secrets long buried. Miss Marple gathered Agnes, Crowthorne, Peel and Elsie in the drawing-room, her tone gentle but resolute. "This is not merely a story of a man's death, but of many lives entwined by past wrongs. Every motive here is a thread in a much larger tapestry." Faces tightened, eyes flickered with unease. The dusk had deepened into a velvety twilight by the time Miss Marple convened the household once more in the drawing-room of Bleakstone Hollow. The heavy curtains were drawn, the fire cast flickering shadows against the aged wallpaper, and the air hummed with a quiet tension, as if the house itself awaited the moment when its long-held secrets might finally surface. Miss Marple rose from her chair, a glint of quiet determination in her eyes. "Sometimes," she began softly, "the truth is not found in the loud declarations, nor in the obvious evidence. Rather, it reveals itself in how a person reacts when their story is gently disturbed." She turned to face the gathered group. Agnes Harrow, composed but watchful. Lionel Crowthorne, his eyes guarded. Mr. Peel, impassive as ever. And Elsie, still pale but attentive. Each bore the weight of suspicion, yet none had cracked under direct questioning. "I have an idea," Miss Marple said, reaching into her knitting bag and pulling out a small, delicate box. "It's quite simple, a test of memory and instinct." She opened the box to reveal a collection of everyday items: a wilted violet pastille tin, a worn leather glove, a faded rose petal, and a small glass vial, the very vial found hidden in the pastilles tin behind the garden statue. "I want each of you," she said, "to hold these objects, one at a time, and tell me the first thought or memory that comes to mind." A murmur of surprise spread through the room. Miss Marple smiled. "There is no right or wrong answer, only what comes from the heart." One by one they complied. Agnes handled the violet tin first. Her fingers trembled slightly. "Charles used to carry these," she murmured, "for his nerves." Her eyes flickered briefly toward the vial. "I never thought he'd use anything stronger." Next, Lionel took the leather glove. He examined it closely, then looked up with a thin smile. "A relic," he said smoothly, "like so many things we cling to." Peel received the rose petal. His rugged hands closed around it briefly before he crushed it without thought. "Bitterness," he said curtly. Finally Elsie took the vial. Her face paled further, and for a long moment she said nothing. Miss Marple observed her closely. "You seem troubled." Elsie swallowed hard. I don't remember seeing that vial until recently, but I think I saw it before." "Where?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "In the study," Elsie whispered. After the morning. And who was there? Miss Marple asked softly. Elsie's eyes darted to Lionel Crowthorne, then to Agnes, then to Peel. I'm not sure. I was afraid to look. The room held its breath. Miss Marple then turned to Crowthorne. Mr. Crowthorne, you've spoken of old grievances and lost trust. But what of this vial? Were you aware of it before today? Crowthorne's composed facade faltered for just a fraction of a second, a blink too quick to be honest. No, he said, voice steady. I had no knowledge of it. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Interesting, because, Mr. Peel, you seemed so quick to dismiss this rose petal just now. Yet, you were the last to enter the study before the maid brought tea and the first to notice Mr. Denham's body. Peel's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Sometimes, Miss Marple continued, it is not what we say, but what we don't say that tells the story. The room was silent, save for the crackling fire. And Elsie, Miss Marple added softly, fear often makes us protect those we love, but it can also blind us. If you remember something more, anything at all, please tell me. Elsie nodded, swallowing her fear. As the evening wound down, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly. The test had not revealed all answers, but it had exposed a fissure in Crowthorne's armour, a subtle hesitation, a reflexive denial that did not sit right. She decided then to observe him more closely in the days ahead. For in the quiet reactions, in the small, unguarded moments, lay the key to unravelling the final thread of this intricate tapestry of deception. The next morning dawned cold and brittle, the kind of English winter that felt as though it might crack like porcelain underfoot. Frost dusted the windows of Bleakstone Hollow like powdered sugar on a forgotten cake. Inside, the atmosphere had turned just as brittle. Miss Marple sat near the fire, knitting untouched in her lap, her gaze fixed not on the flames but on the empty space on the side table where, only the night before, the pastil tin had sat. It was gone, and not just the tin, the glass vial, the contents, the single thread of evidence tying the death of Charles Denham to anything more sinister than mere natural failure, vanished. I placed it here, Miss Marple said quietly, after the observation, exercise last night. And now... Mrs. Harrow stood at the edge of the room, stiff as a statue. No one but family and staff entered this drawing-room overnight. Staff, yes, muttered Lionel Crowthorne, who had wandered in half-dressed with his collar askew. And which of them can we really trust? For all we know, the girl with the tray is the one who tampered with it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed at the comment. There had been something in his voice, an edge too sharp for mere frustration. She turned instead to Agnes. "May I ask, madam, who keeps the master keys to the house?" Agnes hesitated only briefly. "I do," she said, "though Peel has a spare, for emergencies." Peel, summoned moments later, showed no surprise. "I noticed it missing at dawn. I assumed you had moved it for safekeeping, Miss Marple." "No," she said flatly, "and I would not have left it unguarded." He inclined his head. "Then we have a thief among us. Or worse," she added. The drawing-room was sealed off. Miss Marple requested, with quiet authority, that no one enter or leave the estate without her knowledge. Despite having no formal power, something in her gaze made obedience natural. The loss of the vial was more than an inconvenience. It was a warning. Someone here knew how close she had come to the truth, and they were frightened enough to act. Later that morning, she requested to speak with Elsie alone. The young maid sat opposite her, nervous fingers twisting the hem of her apron. "Elsie," Miss Marple said gently, "I don't believe you took the vial." "But I do think you know who did." Elsie shook her head too quickly. "No, miss, I swear. You remember things in pieces, that's natural. But I need you to recall who passed through the drawing-room this morning, who lingered, who had a reason to search." Tears welled in the girl's eyes. It was Peel, just before dawn. I thought nothing of it. He said he was checking the fire." "Did he touch the side table?" Elsie nodded slowly. When confronted, Peel did not deny it. "I did tend the fire, the embers were low, but as for the vial, I never saw it." Miss Marple studied him. "Why not mention this earlier?" He looked her in the eye, calm and unreadable. "Because I didn't think it important. It was too neat, too measured. Miss Marple had met his kind before, men trained not just in service but in silence. She returned to the drawing-room that evening. The guests had retreated into corners of suspicion, each avoiding the other's eyes. A storm of distrust crackled beneath the surface, unspoken but potent. "I once knew a girl," Miss Marple said aloud to the room, "who stole something she didn't understand. Not because she wished harm, but because she believed it would protect someone she loved." Agnes looked up sharply. "She returned it eventually," Miss Marple continued, "but it was too late. The damage had already been done." There was no response, only the ticking of the ancient grandfather clock in the hall. She watched Lionel Crowthorne carefully, saw the flicker of irritation on his brow, saw him glance involuntarily toward the fireplace. Not the side table, the fireplace. Her eyes narrowed. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Miss Marple lit the hearth again. This time, not to warm the room, but to search its ashes. She wore gloves and moved delicately, using iron tongs to sift through the blackened debris. It took nearly an hour. At last, she found it. The twisted remnant of glass, the melted remains of the vial, buried deep beneath the logs. She wrapped it carefully and placed it in her bag. By morning, the tone in the house had shifted once more. Fear had curdled into tension, and tension into desperation. The theft had shaken everyone's confidence. There were no longer alliances, only wary glances and cold civility. Miss Marple requested the presence of the family in the conservatory, where the light was bright and the air felt less cloistered. "I have recovered what I believe to be the remains of the missing vial," she announced, "burned in the fireplace after midnight." No one spoke. Whoever destroyed it hoped to erase the truth. But here's the thing about truth. It lingers. In ashes, in silences, in the way people react when they think no one is watching. She turned to Peel. "You did not take the vial, but you lied to protect someone. Who?" His jaw clenched. "To Agnes. You said you had no knowledge of the vial, but you recognized it last night. Your expression gave you away. Was it Charles who used it first, or was it someone else?" Her mouth opened, then closed again. Finally, to Lionel Crowthorne. "You burned it? Why?" His composure, so carefully maintained, fractured. "Because it doesn't matter," he snapped. "Because Charles was already dead, and that little bottle changes nothing. Nothing." "Oh," Miss Marple said softly, "but it does. It changes everything." As the fire crackled behind them once more, Miss Marple felt the temperature in the room drop, not from the cold, but from the sense that the truth, long buried, was finally beginning to rise. The destruction of the vial had not stopped her. It had only confirmed what she already knew. Someone in Bleakstone Hollow would kill again, if it meant keeping the past from being revealed. And now, they knew Miss Marple was close, very close. Rain had started again, thin and cold as needles, lashing the stone eaves of Elmridge. The manor looked no less sinister than it had a week ago, when the first body turned up. Inside, lights flickered across antique glass and brocade, faint defences against the encroaching night. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room beside the fire, not warming herself so much as watching it. The dancing. Flames cast faint silhouettes on the walls, flickering like the ghosts of Elmridge's secrets. Her knitting needles lay idle in her lap. Her gaze, sharp beneath the softness of age, was fixed on nothing and everything. Across the room, Inspector Chappelle was pacing. "I don't like it," he muttered. "First the torn letter goes missing, then the decanter is cleaned before we could test it, and now this." He handed her a telegram, the paper damp at the edges from the rain. Miss Marple took it and read in silence. The words were few, but their implication struck hard. Gerald Hartridge missing. Blood found in stable loft. Horse gone. Police notified. Merton Station. Miss Marple folded the telegram with quiet precision. "He's running," Chappelle said. "That's what cowards do. Hartridge must have been in it from the start." Miss Marple didn't look up. Perhaps, or perhaps he simply knew he was next. They found Gerald Hartridge's body the next morning in the brook beyond the southern hedgerow, face down, soaked and broken from a fall off the ridge above. It might have looked like an accident, but Miss Marple noted the horse's reins wound tight around one boot and deep bruising beneath the collar. He had been dragged, Chappelle's men moved swiftly, cordoning the scene and interviewing staff. Fear gripped Elmridge more tightly than before. It was no longer just about Edmund Blackwell's murder. Now, someone was eliminating those who knew too much, or worse, those who had once been complicit. Back inside, the drawing room had become the detective's sanctuary. The suspects, knowingly or not, seemed drawn to it, each taking turns in the chair opposite Miss Marple. She let them come to her, saying little, listening much. First was Lillian, Edmund's widow. Dressed in mourning black, she clutched a locket, her eyes glassy with exhaustion. Gerald always hated Edmund, she said, but he'd never have killed him. Not unless something forced him. Forced him? Miss Marple echoed. She nodded. Blackmail. That letter you mentioned, it wasn't about money, I think. It was a warning. Miss Marple asked gently, "What did he know?" Lillian's hands trembled. Something about Vera's first husband. He died young, too. She always avoided talking about it. But I heard Gerald once threaten to reveal something if Edmund didn't back away from her investments. Next came Vera, poised, immaculate, and colder than the glass of gin she sipped from. When asked about Gerald, she laughed softly. "I was fond of Gerald in my way," she said. "But he was a fool, the sort who thinks secrets are weapons he alone can wield." Miss Marple asked about her late husband. Vera's eyes flickered. "He drowned, in a boating accident. Nothing criminal about that." "Only," Miss Marple said mildly, "your husband couldn't swim." "And he never went near water willingly, according to town records." Vera rose, unbothered. "It's funny how people insist on rewriting stories after the fact." The final visitor was young Oliver, the stable boy. His eyes were bloodshot from sleeplessness. "I didn't kill him," he said, before Miss Marple could speak. "I swear it." "I know," she replied, "but someone's trying to make it look as if you did. The missing horse, the blood in the loft. Clumsy staging, wouldn't you say?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "I saw her, you know." "Who?" "Miss Vera. She was in the stables the night Gerald died. Said she was looking for the ledger, but she had gloves on. No one wears gloves to check the feed bins." Miss Marple nodded slightly, as if that fit too neatly. She didn't sleep that night. At dawn she returned to the stables, following a path through the frost-hardened grass. Inside the loft, where Gerald's blood had soaked the hay, she found something new, a second set of boot prints, smaller than Gerald's, pressed faintly into the straw. She looked up toward the beams overhead. It was the perfect vantage point. Someone had waited. The next move came quickly. Inspector Chappelle was reviewing evidence in the study that afternoon when a small fire broke out in the kitchen. Only a grease fire, easily contained, but the distraction gave someone the time they needed. When they returned, the file containing Lillian's account of her late husband's finances was gone. Chappelle cursed. "That's it. We pull them all in. Vera, Lillian, even Oliver. One of them is covering for the other." But Miss Marple raised a hand. "No," she said quietly. "That's precisely what they want. They're tightening the noose. If we panic, we'll miss it." He looked at her. "Then what do we do?" She smiled faintly. "We set a trap." That night, a letter was slipped beneath Vera's door, a forgery designed by Miss Marple herself. The message was simple and direct. "I know what happened to Edmund. Meet me at the stable loft. Midnight. Come alone." She waited in the shadows, wrapped in a thick shawl against the chill. Midnight came. Then a figure appeared, gliding silently through the dark yard. Vera. She entered the loft, closed the door. Miss Marple crept after her, heart pounding, not with fear but with the growing weight of certainty. From inside there came the sound of footsteps pacing, then a voice, soft and almost regretful. "You should have stayed silent." Miss Marple stepped in. "I'm afraid silence is what you used far too well, my dear." Vera spun, startled, but the pistol in her hand didn't waver. "I had to," she said coldly. "They were all weak. Edmund, Gerald, even Lillian. I warned them not to pry." Miss Marple looked at her calmly. "And Oliver?" Vera blinked. "What?" "You didn't see him on the beams that night," Miss Marple said. "But he saw you. Everything unravelled after that, didn't it?" Vera stepped forward. "They would have ruined me. All of them." Miss Marple met her gaze. "So, you ruined them first." The sound of footsteps approached from behind. Chapelle and 2 constables, drawn by the lantern Miss Marple had placed in the window as a signal. Vera lowered the pistol slowly, defeated but unrepentant. As she was led away, she cast one glance over her shoulder. "I buried them," she said, "but they dug themselves in first." Outside, dawn was breaking, and Elmridge, though quieter now, had finally spoken the truth. It was raining again, thin, relentless sheets of it, the kind of rain that made the village of Charnley feel like it was slowly dissolving into the earth. The day had broken grey and weary, as if the sky itself had grown tired of watching Miss Marple at work. But she, as always, was quietly unbothered by the weather. She stood by the hearth in the vicar's study, a steaming cup of tea in hand, her eyes fixed not on the rain-soaked windows, but on something far less obvious, the small bronze horse figurine on the mantelpiece. "It's quite an odd thing," she said softly, half to herself, half to Reverend Calhoun, who had just returned from making a statement to Inspector Graves. The vicar followed her gaze. "Oh, that old thing. Mrs. Trost gave it to me years ago. Said it reminded her of her late husband's horse. Why?" Miss Marple set her cup down. "Because it's the only item in this room that's ever moved." He blinked at her. "Pardon?" "It was on the far right last week," she said calmly. "Now it's left of centre, and someone with arthritis wouldn't move it just for symmetry." The vicar flushed slightly. "Well, I may have nudged it when dusting." "You don't dust, Reverend," she said with a smile. "Your housekeeper does. And she wasn't here on Tuesday, was she?" The room fell silent. Then he shook his head. She wasn't." Miss Marple turned back to the window, watching as the village's residents trudged across the green umbrellas and slickers, forming a parade of anxious colour. There had been a second murder. Anthony Bellows, the solicitor, found dead in the archive room beneath the church, slumped across records that spanned over a century. The official word was accident, an unfortunate fall. But Miss Marple knew better. His death had been too timely, too precise, and it had come just as she'd begun to question a will Bellows had helped draft, one that named Julia Trost as the sole beneficiary of Harold Linton's estate. What had begun as a single murder had turned into a storm of vanishing evidence, twisted motives, and rising panic. Yet, in the eye of that storm, something now clicked into place. Not a confession, not a clue, something smaller. 2 nights earlier, she dined with Mrs. Burney, the widow with a fondness for dramatics and too many cats. Over cream scones and over steep tea, Mrs. Burney had said quite offhandedly, "Strange, isn't it, how every man Julia loved seemed to just disappear?" At the time, it had sounded like petty spite, but Miss Marple, in her wisdom, had written it down. Now, flipping through her notebook, she stared at the names: Harold Linton, Charles Trost, Walter Hennings, and now Anthony Bellows. Her pencil hovered. Bellows hadn't been romantically involved with Julia, but he had been involved with her affairs and her secrets. That alone could be deadly, but it was the figurine that had started the unravelling. Someone had been in this room, someone who had needed access to the archives, and who had known that Bellows would be there, alone. A pattern, long buried, began to surface, not of romance, but of proximity. Every man who died, Linton, Trost, Hennings, now Bellows, had come into Julia Trost's orbit just weeks before their deaths, and always she had something to gain. Money, property, silence, and yet she'd never been close enough to hold the smoking gun. But Miss Marple knew people better than she knew crimes, and she knew when someone was hiding behind grief. Earlier that morning, Julia had paid a visit to the police station, not as a suspect, but to offer a forgotten letter, a supposed suicide note from Harold Linton, conveniently unearthed from behind a bookshelf. Its tone was theatrical, unlike Harold's steady legal style. She had explained its sudden appearance with a tremulous voice and watery eyes. "I didn't know it was there, I swear," she had told Inspector Graves. Miss Marple had watched her carefully. Her shoes were dry, though she'd claimed to have come across the green during the heaviest rain, and there had been ink smudges on her left thumb, a curious stain for someone who claimed not to have touched the letter herself. Now a memory returned, something Charles Trost had once said at a dinner, years ago, after too much port. Julia's not the sort to cry over spilled wine, or spilled blood, if it came to that. At the time, it had drawn awkward laughter. Looking back, it had been a warning. Miss Marple stood and collected her coat. "Where are you going?" the vicar asked. "To find a woman with too many secrets," she replied, "and a fountain pen she shouldn't own." As she stepped out into the cold drizzle, she recalled one more detail, a list she'd asked the church archivist to compile. It hadn't seemed relevant before. A list of all donations made anonymously to the church over the last decade. The most frequent donor? A Mrs. Julia Trost. Miss Marple smiled grimly. The pattern had been there all along, in the habits of the generous, in the positioning of a bronze horse, in the offhand comments of gossips, and now the truth was ready to surface, dragged out not by force but by patience and a very sharp eye. The pieces were falling into place, but she would need one more move to catch the widow red-handed. The drizzle thickened to a cold mist as Miss Marple ascended the cobbled lane toward Ferncroft House, Julia Trost's ivy-draped estate at the edge of Charnley. Despite its picturesque garden and welcoming lamps, the place seemed oddly sterile, too curated, too perfect, like a portrait hung to conceal a crack in the wall. She'd come without appointment, umbrella tapping softly at her side. The front door was opened by Julia herself, clad in a flowing robe of midnight blue, her hair wrapped tightly in a silk scarf. "Miss Marple," she said, eyes widening. "How unexpected! Come in, please." The warmth of the foyer was immediate, but something in the air clung like dust, an unease that had nothing to do with the weather. Julia led her to a drawing-room filled with muted pastels, family portraits, and a faint scent of lavender. "Tea?" she offered with practised politeness. "No, thank you, dear," Miss Marple said, settling into a brocade armchair. "I won't take much of your time. I only came to ask a few questions, just some loose ends I can't quite make tidy." Julia perched delicately across from her, the flicker of a fireplace casting shadows against her cheekbones. "Of course, anything I can do to help." Miss Marple smiled gently. "You've been most helpful already. But you see, I've begun to wonder, not just about who committed these dreadful crimes, but why. And that's often the most telling part of all, isn't it?" Julia's smile stiffened. "It's terrible, all of it. Poor Anthony Bellows. And Harold, of course. But I hardly see what else there is to say." "Oh, there's quite a bit," Miss Marple said kindly. "For instance, the anonymous donations to the church. You've been quite charitable over the years, far more than your late husband's will suggested you could afford." There was a flicker of surprise. "I don't see how that's relevant." "It wouldn't be," said Miss Marple, "if not for the discrepancy, and the handwriting. You see, I happened upon that curious letter you gave the police, Harold Linton's supposed suicide note. There's something remarkably theatrical about it, wouldn't you say?" Julia folded her hands. He was under a great deal of stress. Perhaps, but his letters, journals, even his legal briefs were never so florid. You, on the other hand, have a most elegant pen. I took the liberty of examining your handwriting from some holiday cards you sent to Reverend Calhoun. Now Julia's poise cracked just slightly, a tightening of the jaw, a slow blink. "I've no idea what you're implying." "Only that this was never about money, was it?" Miss Marple said softly. "You had access to wealth already. You could have married again, easily. And yet, these deaths, one by one each man connected to you falls. Harold Linton, Charles Trost, Walter Hennings, and finally Anthony Bellows." Julia stood abruptly and walked to the window, arms crossed, voice low. "You think I murdered them?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that you believe you saved them." Silence, a long, weighty silence. Then Julia whispered, "You don't know what it's like to watch someone you care about slowly wither, to beg them to leave, to get help, to live, and be ignored." Miss Marple rose, approaching her carefully. "Then tell me what this really is." Julia's shoulders trembled. "Harold was the first. so bright, so accomplished, but he began to forget things, important things. At first it was names. Then he left the oven on 3 times in 1 week. He accused me of stealing from him. By the time the diagnosis came, early onset Alzheimer's, he was already slipping away. And the man I'd fallen in love with, he was gone. Miss Marple listened quietly, breath held. I stayed with him until the end. He died in a care facility, but not before he begged me to make sure no one else went through what he had. He told me to be kind, to act if I saw it again. Don't let them rot, he said. Promise me, Julia. And I did. She turned back to Miss Marple, eyes glassy. Charles was next. He'd been my friend long before Harold. He started to forget the words to hymns he'd known since childhood. Walter Hennings would come to dinner and repeat the same joke 3 times in an evening, not realizing. Anthony had begun hoarding documents and locking them away. He'd written a will for someone else, and forgotten entirely by the next morning. So, Miss Marple said quietly, you decided to put them to rest. Gently, without pain. Julia exhaled, her face hollow. It wasn't murder, not in my eyes, it was mercy. Miss Marple didn't speak right away. There was no triumph in her expression, no condemnation either, only sorrow. But you forged Harold's note and manipulated Anthony's death to look like an accident. You moved the church archives, you edited his records, and now they're all dead. Deaths you planned. Julia's voice sharpened, because I knew no one else would understand. The world doesn't see it until it's too late. I spared them the humiliation, the disintegration. I gave them peace. Miss Marple's voice softened. Or did you try to spare yourself? Julia flinched. Perhaps, Miss Marple continued, the real pain was in watching them disappear before your eyes. The helplessness, the loneliness. Perhaps it wasn't kindness, but fear, your fear that drove you. Julia sank back into the chair, her eyes suddenly distant. It was fear. I suppose I didn't want to be alone again. Not like with Harold. Not watching someone fade away one memory at a time. I couldn't go through that again. I believe you, said Miss Marple gently. And I believe you loved them, each in your own way. But Julia, that doesn't make it right. They sat in silence, the storm outside beginning to wane. Somewhere far off. A church bell rang the hour. At last, Julia nodded, a brittle sigh escaping her lips. So, what now? Miss Marple gave her a long, quiet look. That's not for me to decide, but you must tell the truth. If not to the police, then to yourself. Julia closed her eyes, the weight of years pressing down at once. You're right. And for the first time in years, Julia Trost wept, not for the dead, but for what she had become to survive them. Evening had come to Saint, Mallows once again, casting long shadows through the frost-glazed hedges of Widow Featherstone's garden. Inside, the warmth of the parlour flickered against the windows as a fire crackled low in the hearth. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap, eyes trained on the door. Across from her, Chief Inspector Cray paced restlessly, occasionally shooting wary glances at the grandfather clock. They were waiting, not for the authorities, not for backup, but for the killer. All the pieces were now aligned. Earlier that day, Miss Marple had visited the churchyard, not to lay flowers, but to observe, to think. And there, amidst the moss-covered stones, she found her answer, not in words, but in absences. The missing birth record of Arthur Crowthorne, the forged certificate tucked into the parish archives. It was a puzzle only someone deeply embedded in village life could have noticed. Arthur, whose past had always seemed too neatly scrubbed. Arthur, who had never spoken of childhood. Arthur, who had just appeared in the 1980s, marrying a woman far older, inheriting everything when she passed, and never once looking back. Miss Marple had gone straight to the solicitor, and there, in a dusty file drawer, she uncovered what she'd suspected. Arthur was not Arthur at all. He was Leonard Lenny Dobbs, convicted of fraud in 1971, vanished while out on bail. A man with a history of forging documents, charming wealthy women, and, perhaps most chillingly, a dead fiancé who'd once slipped down a flight of stairs. It had all come together after the second murder. Mr. Compton, found drowned in the duck pond behind his cottage, a seemingly random death, ruled accidental by the coroner. But Miss Marple had seen the puncture marks behind the knees, traces of a paralytic. Compton had been Arthur's business partner, and he'd recently begun divorce proceedings, alleging Arthur had embezzled company funds. Arthur stood to lose everything if the matter went to court. So, he silenced him. But even that wasn't the end. In digging further, Miss Marple had traced a twisted web of Arthur's romantic past. All the wives, lovers, and women who died shortly after marrying him, always with their finances conveniently merged. There were 5, each declared natural causes, all wealthy, all conveniently childless, all buried by the same hands. Now, with the noose tightening, Arthur, or Lenny, had grown desperate. The second murder had been his attempt to throw the investigation into chaos, pin the earlier deaths on someone else, perhaps even frame young Elsie, the maid, who'd stumbled upon the vial hidden in the conservatory. But Miss Marple had preempted him. She'd planted false information, quietly telling him that a letter written by Mrs. Featherstone had surfaced, accusing her husband of plotting her death, and now she was waiting to see if he'd come for it. At precisely 8:30, the doorknob turned slowly. Arthur stepped inside, his coat damp from the mist, his eyes glinting. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said lightly, though his voice was tight. "Not at all," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Do come in. You must be cold." He sat, glancing around the room. "I heard a curious thing today. Someone said you'd found a letter from Margaret." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "It's upstairs, in her sewing drawer. I haven't yet shown it to the police." Arthur's smile was a fraction too quick. "Perhaps I could see it." "Of course, though I must admit," she said, rising slowly from her chair, "I'd hoped to wait for Inspector Cray." Arthur followed her to the staircase, but halfway up, Miss Marple stopped. She turned suddenly and said softly, "It's strange, Mr. Dobbs. You always spoke so warmly of Margaret, and yet she hated tea with lemon. You insisted she drank it every morning." Arthur froze. "I beg your pardon. It's in the note, a small thing, but the devil, as they say, is in the details. As it often is in murder." His eyes narrowed. "There is no note, is there?" "Oh, there is," Miss Marple said gently. "But not from Margaret, from Lillian Delaney. She left a diary, one your solicitor never found." Arthur turned then, heading quickly back down the stairs. But the inspector was already waiting in the entry hall, flanked by 2 constables. Arthur spun, suddenly calm again. "You're making a terrible mistake." Miss Marple's voice came from behind him, quiet, unwavering. "You made it first, with Lillian, with Margaret, with Elsie, when you tried to make her your scapegoat, and with poor Mr. Compton, who trusted you." Arthur's facade cracked just slightly, and he lunged. The constables moved fast. It was over in seconds. Later, as Arthur Dobbs, alias Crowthorne, was led into the police car, Miss Marple stood quietly by the gate. Inspector Cray joined her. "You always do it," he said. "You always see what the rest of us miss." She smiled faintly, gazing into the fog. "Murder," she said, "is rarely a grand design. More often it is a habit, a creeping thing, done once out of desperation, then again out of convenience, and then simply because it worked." He nodded slowly. "Will you be writing it all down?" "Oh, I don't think so," she said, glancing back at the quiet house. "But I imagine the papers will come up with something dramatic." And indeed, they did. A week later, the St. Mary Mead Gazette ran a front-page story. "The widow who buried all her lovers, and the woman who stopped him." Miss Marple didn't read it. She was busy tending her rose garden, thinking not of murderers, but of the quiet dignity of justice, and of tea, without lemon. The morning sun filtered weakly through the fog as Miss Marple sat quietly by her garden gate, the scent of freshly turned earth mingling with the faint aroma of brewing tea. The village of St. Malo had begun to breathe again after the storm of scandal and suspicion had passed. Arthur Dobbs, once known as Arthur Crowthorne, had been taken away, his sinister secrets finally uncovered. The papers had praised Miss Marple's sharp insight, and the village folk whispered of her as their silent guardian. Yet, even as the world seemed to settle back into its peaceful rhythm, a small, nagging unease lingered in Miss Marple's mind. She'd learned long ago that evil rarely revealed itself in full at once. It often hid behind a curtain, waiting for the opportune moment to leap forward once more. That very unease was confirmed when a letter arrived, slipped beneath her door in a familiar handwriting she had only just begun to understand. That of Julia Trost. The letter was brief but chilling. You think the truth ended with Arthur Dobbs? You're mistaken. The puppeteer remains behind the curtain. Look closely where shadows gather, and you will find the last thread of the tapestry. J.T. Miss Marple folded the note carefully, then reached for her coat. The day was just beginning, but she knew her work was not done. Her first stop was Ferncroft House once more. Julia Trost had been cooperative since her confession, undergoing questioning and offering what information she could. Miss Marple knew Julia's motivations were complex, a mix of fear, love, and desperation, but now she wondered if Julia had been manipulated herself. Julia answered the door, visibly startled to see Miss Marple so soon. "Miss Marple," she said cautiously, "is there more you wish to know?" "Indeed, Julia. Your note was intriguing. You suggest the real mastermind is yet at large." Julia hesitated, then nodded. "There's someone you've overlooked." "Who?" "Margaret Featherstone's brother, Thomas. He's been close to the family for years, more than anyone suspected. He controlled much behind the scenes, especially regarding the estate and financial dealings, and he was none too pleased about Arthur's arrival." Miss Marple felt a chill. Thomas Featherstone was a man of impeccable reputation, a pillar of the community, and the vicar's closest confidant. If Julia's suspicions were true, then this case had far more tangled roots. The vicar's study was dark when Miss Marple arrived, the curtains drawn tightly against the gloomy afternoon light. Reverend Calhoun looked up from a book, surprise flickering across his face. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe this pleasure?" She smiled gently. "I'm afraid it's a matter of grave importance, Reverend. I wonder if I might speak with Mr. Featherstone privately." The Reverend's eyes darted toward the closed door. "I'm afraid Thomas is away on business." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Would that be the same business trip he mentioned just this morning?" He nodded uneasily. "Well," she said softly, "I suspect we shall be seeing him very soon." That very evening, at the village hall, a gathering was convened under the guise of a community meeting. Miss Marple arranged for Thomas Featherstone to be present, along with the remaining key figures of the case, Julia Trost, Inspector Cray, Reverend Calhoun, and a handful of townsfolk. When Thomas entered, the room's atmosphere shifted. There was a stiffness in his posture, a coolness in his gaze. Miss Marple greeted him warmly. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Featherstone. There are some matters that require clarity." Thomas smiled thinly. "I'm happy to assist." Miss Marple began carefully, recounting the facts, the deaths, the forged documents, the vanished evidence, and then, turning to Julia's letter, she revealed her doubts about the full story. "I believe," she said, "that Arthur Dobbs was but a pawn, a tool wielded by a more cunning hand." Thomas's expression hardened. "I assure you I had no knowledge of any such scheme." "Yet you controlled the estate, the finances, and you had the motive to protect the family name. You also had the means." A silence fell. Thomas glanced toward the windows, then back. Suddenly his voice was cold. "You're wrong, Miss Marple. I did what I had to protect our legacy." "Legacy?" Miss Marple pressed. "At what cost?" "You think I let a fraud like Dobbs sully the Featherstone name? I ensured he was removed. I manipulated Julia to do what was necessary." The room gasped. "You used Julia?" "The poor woman who thought she was sparing loved ones from suffering?" "I merely gave her the push she needed," Thomas said quietly. "Sometimes a gentle nudge is all it takes to set things right." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And the others? The deaths that preceded Dobbs' arrival?" Thomas's jaw clenched. "Collateral damage." "Monsters don't see collateral damage," she said softly. "Only obstacles." Suddenly, Thomas lunged toward her, a concealed dagger flashing in the dim light. But before he could strike, Inspector Cray tackled him, the blade clattering to the floor. As he was restrained, Thomas snarled, "You'll never understand, Marple. I did it all for love, for protection." Miss Marple, steady despite the adrenaline, replied, "Love without mercy is cruelty." Weeks later, in the quiet of her garden, Miss Marple reflected on the final revelation. Evil had worn many masks in St. Malo. The charming impostor, the desperate widow, and the pious guardian twisted by fear and control. But the truth had surfaced, not as a single villain's tale, but as a web of human frailty and dark necessity. She smiled faintly, lifting her teacup. In the end, justice had been served, imperfect, slow, but unyielding. And Miss Marple, as ever, remained vigilant, knowing that the shadows would always linger just beyond the light. The chill of early autumn hung heavy in the air as the villagers of St. Malo gathered in the modest courtroom at the county seat, the murmur of whispered conversations punctuating the otherwise solemn atmosphere. Miss Marple sat near the back, knitting needles resting idly beside her, her keen eyes scanning the faces before her. This was the culmination of months of tangled investigations, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Now it was time for justice, or so the court would decide. Thomas Featherstone sat rigid in the defendant's chair, his usual calm veneer cracked, revealing a man weary from his own web of deceit. The prosecution laid bare the sequence of deaths, forged documents and manipulation, weaving a narrative that left little doubt. Featherstone had orchestrated much of the tragedy that had darkened the village, using Arthur Dobbs as his pawn, coercing Julia Trost, and eliminating anyone who threatened the Featherstone name. Yet, as the trial unfolded, a subtle tension simmered beneath the surface, one that only Miss Marple noticed, a faint reluctance in some testimonies, a quiet hesitation in the witnesses' eyes. Something was still unsettled. After the judge's gavel declared the case adjourned, the villagers began to file out. Miss Marple lingered, inviting Inspector Cray for a walk along the fog-draped village green. "You're certain we have the right man?" Cray asked, voice low. Miss Marple considered the question. "We have the man who pulled the strings, certainly, but there's one final detail that most overlooked." She reached into her pocket, producing a small folded scrap of paper. It was a receipt, aged and almost lost among the mountain of evidence. It documented a payment made several years before the first death to an obscure chemical supplier in a neighbouring town. Cray's brow furrowed. "But the murders spanned decades." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but the poison used in the last two deaths was a rare neurotoxin. I suspected the earlier deaths were natural or accidents, but the truth is darker. The toxin was present in the village long before we imagined," she continued, "and someone else had access. Someone close. Someone trusted." The inspector's eyes widened. "Your first suspect, Julia Trost, confessed to mercy killings, but she lacked the knowledge to procure such poisons. Arthur Dobbs was a fraud, but was unaware of the chemical intricacies. Thomas Featherstone orchestrated the final events, but did not act alone." Cray's voice was a whisper now. "Who then?" Miss Marple's gaze settled on the empty garden bench near the chapel. "The late Reverend Calhoun," Cray startled, "but he was above suspicion. Everyone admired him." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "His position gave him perfect cover, his visits to the sick, his access to the churchyard, his trustworthiness a shield. Yet he was known to possess a private interest in botany and chemicals, an interest that began before the first suspicious death." She recounted how subtle signs had been missed. The Reverend's insistence on keeping the church archives closed, the unexplained absences on days preceding deaths, and a faint but distinct scent of a certain flower known to carry neurotoxic compounds lingering in his study. Cray shook his head. "You're certain?" "I had my suspicions," Miss Marple admitted, "and I confronted him once, but without proof nothing could be done. Then he died suddenly of a heart attack." The inspector exhaled. "So, justice will never be served fully." Miss Marple smiled, a mixture of sadness and resolve in her eyes. "Justice is rarely perfect, but we can honour those lost by never forgetting the truths hidden in shadows." Back in St. Malo, the village slowly healed. Thomas Featherstone was sentenced for his crimes, Julia Trost committed to a care home where she could find peace, and Arthur Dobbs's name was finally stripped of its falsehood. Yet the shadow of Reverend Calhoun's unseen hand left an unease, a reminder that some villains escape justice, not for lack of guilt, but because the world isn't always ready to face them. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, sitting by the fire as dusk settled. She picked up her knitting and reflected on the case, the missed clues, the overlooked whispers, the thin line between mercy and madness. And with a quiet sigh, she prepared for whatever mysteries tomorrow might bring, knowing she would always be one step ahead. The village of St. Malo lay bathed in the soft glow of dawn, its narrow lanes still hushed beneath a blanket of morning mist. Birds stirred in the hedgerows, their gentle songs weaving through the crisp air, and life, for the moment, had returned to its steady rhythm. Yet, for Miss Marple, the peace was bittersweet. She walked slowly along the familiar footpath leading from the courthouse back to her modest cottage at the village edge. Her thoughts churned, not with relief over the recent verdict, but with the quiet stirrings of doubt that refused to be silenced. The case of the widow who buried all her lovers had been declared closed, yet a faint, nagging unease clung stubbornly to the edges of her mind. The village had spoken of justice served. Thomas Featherstone was imprisoned. Julia Trost was safely removed from harm's way. Arthur Dobbs' treacheries had been exposed. But Miss Marple had learned that justice is rarely a neat package, tied and delivered without frayed edges or loose ends. As she approached the gate of her cottage, her eyes caught a glimmer beneath the nearby oak tree. There lay a small, folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age and marked with the peculiar emblem of a black rose, the very same emblem embroidered on a handkerchief Julia Trost had once been seen clutching. Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple retrieved it carefully. Unfolding the note, her eyes scanned the elegant script. Not all shadows are cast by the guilty. Some conceal truths too fragile for daylight. Look beyond what you see. The story is far from over. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. The handwriting was unmistakably Julia's, but the message hinted at secrets deeper still. Had Julia left this as a warning or a plea? Was there someone else lurking in the wings, whose role had yet to be revealed? She slipped the note into her pocket and turned toward her cottage door. Inside, on her small writing desk, lay the scattered papers from the case. Witness statements, reports, and her own notes filled with meticulous observations. Her gaze settled on a detail that had once seemed inconsequential, a faint, irregular pattern in the timestamps of the anonymous donations to the church. They weren't random. They followed a subtle sequence, tied perhaps to local festivals or celestial events. Why had that escaped attention before? Miss Marple settled into her favourite armchair, the warmth of the fire reaching her fingertips as she pondered the possibilities. The black rose emblem, the cryptic message, the coded donations. It was a puzzle incomplete, a story paused rather than concluded. Her thoughts drifted to the villagers, those she'd seen only in passing since the trial's end. The quiet ones, the watchers from the shadows. Did any of them know more? Was there a truth buried beneath layers of loyalty, fear, or silence? Her mind flashed to the last conversation with Reverend Calhoun. Though he had passed away, could his sudden death truly have been natural? Or had he been silenced before he could reveal something crucial? Miss Marple sighed softly, the weight of years and mysteries pressing gently on her shoulders. She knew well that in her line of work, endings were seldom endings. Rather, they were beginnings, doorways to new questions, new secrets waiting patiently to be uncovered. The kettle whistled faintly, pulling her from her reverie. As she rose to prepare tea, her eyes caught the ticking of the old grandfather clock. Time moved steadily forward, indifferent to human schemes and secrets, and so would she. With a quiet smile, Miss Marple prepared for the days ahead, ready to listen to the whispers carried on the wind, to watch the subtle shifts in the village's heartbeat, and to follow wherever the next mystery might lead. Because in St. Malo, as in all places shadowed by human nature, a mystery never truly ends. It only waits, and Miss Marple would always be there, waiting too.